Why did my husband demand I get plastic surgery after our neighbor got a mommy makeover? It started small, the way most things that end up wrecking your marriage tend to start small. Diana next door came home from Miami with a flat stomach and a new way of standing in her driveway. Hip cocked, sunglasses pushed up into hair that used to be a mom bun and was suddenly professionally blown out. She'd been gone 11 days. Her husband Greg posted a picture of her on the beach with a caption that said, "Proud of my wife," and 40-something comments under it. Half of them from women in our neighborhood asking who her surgeon was. Rob saw that post before I did. I know because he mentioned it to me before I'd even opened Instagram that morning, standing at the coffee maker in his work clothes, scrolling on his phone like it was the news. "Diana looks incredible," he said. Just like that. Not mean, not pointed, just a fact dropped into a Tuesday morning like it belonged there. I said something like, "Good for her," and went back to packing lunches. A few days later, he mentioned it again. Kind of casually while we were loading the dishwasher, Greg told him at the gym that the whole thing cost less than they expected, that some places do payment plans now, that recovery wasn't as bad as people made it sound. I remember standing there with a plate in my hand thinking, why does my husband know the financing details of our neighbor's tummy tuck? But I let it go. You let a lot of things go when you have 3 kids under 8 and a husband who works long hours, and you're both just trying to survive the week. Then it kept coming up. At dinner, when Emmy was pushing peas around her plate, and Rob brought up Diana's results like we were discussing a home renovation. In the car, on the way to his mother's house, when he said Greg seemed different lately, lighter, like a weight had been lifted off him too, not just off Diana. Right before bed, when I was too tired to argue and he'd bring it up in that low voice people use when they want you to think they're just thinking out loud, not actually building a case. 2 weeks in, he stopped being casual about it. He sat me down at the kitchen table one Saturday morning while the kids were watching cartoons in the next room, and he did it like it was a business meeting. He'd clearly rehearsed it. He said he thought I should look into getting my stomach fixed. Fixed. That was his exact word. And it's the word that stuck with me every single day since, because I didn't know my stomach was broken until my husband told me it was. I carried 3 kids in this body. Emmy, then Wyatt, then our youngest, Josie, who came almost 2 years ago now with a birth that still visits me in flashes I don't like to talk about. Emergency C-section. She was breech. The cord was wrapped around her neck twice. And what was supposed to be a routine delivery turned into 40 extra minutes of a surgical team moving fast and quiet in a way that still makes my chest tighten to remember. I didn't walk off that table the same person I was when I walked in, and neither did she. I have a scar low on my stomach that I've never really looked at directly in a mirror. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because looking at it means remembering that room, that team of people working over me while Rob stood by my head, holding my hand and saying, it's okay, over and over like a prayer he didn't believe. That's the stomach he wanted fixed. I asked him, sitting at that table, if he understood what he was actually asking me to erase. He didn't answer that. He said Diana's husband seemed happier now, more attentive, like something had shifted in their marriage since she took care of herself. Like that was an answer. Like my body was a maintenance issue that had gone unaddressed too long and was now affecting the household. I didn't cry at the table. I want to be clear about that because when I've told this story to people, the first thing they assume is that I broke down right there, and I didn't. I sat very still and I asked him to repeat what he'd just said, because some part of me needed to hear it twice to actually believe my husband of 9 years had just told me my C-section scar was a problem he wanted solved. He repeated it. Softer the second time, like softness made it kinder. That night, our 5-year-old, Emmy, wandered into the kitchen while I was doing dishes, holding the framed ultrasound photo that's hung in her nursery since before she was born, the black and white one where you can just barely make out her tiny curled up shape at 20 weeks. She climbed into my lap without saying anything and asked why I looked like I'd been crying. I hadn't even realized I wiped my face and told her I was just tired, and she held that photo up and said, "This is when I was still inside you." In that matter-of-fact way little kids say the most devastating things, and I had to leave the room for a minute. I didn't yell at Rob that night. I didn't cry in front of him either, not once. And looking back, I think that scared him more than if I had. Men like Rob, and I say this having loved him for almost a decade, men like Rob know how to handle tears. Tears mean the conversation is escalating in a direction they recognize. What they don't know how to handle is quiet. I waited until the kids were asleep, until the house had gone that particular kind of still it gets after 9 o'clock. And I asked him to come stand next to me in our bathroom. I turned on the big light over the mirror, the harsh one neither of us usually uses because it shows everything, and I told him to point to every single thing about my body he wanted changed, out loud, one thing at a time, and to actually finish the list this time instead of hinting at it for another month through comments about our neighbors. He looked at me like I'd asked him to do something cruel. I told him I wasn't being cruel, I was being efficient, since apparently we were doing this project either way, and I'd rather know the full scope up front. He got through the stomach, and maybe a little more definition here, before his voice actually broke. His hand was still half raised, hovering near my hip, and he just stopped. He couldn't finish it. He stood there in that awful bright light, staring at the reflection of a man who had spent 3 weeks building a case for his wife to surgically erase the physical evidence of the family he claims to love. And something in his face just collapsed inward. He didn't apologize that night. I want to be honest about that too, because I think the clean version of this story is the one where the husband immediately breaks down and says he's sorry and everything resolves in one dramatic bathroom scene, and that's not what happened. He left the bathroom. I heard him go downstairs. I heard the TV turn on and then turn off again 10 minutes later. later, I went to bed alone and lay there staring at the ceiling fan going around, thinking about whether I'd still be lying in this bed in a year. It took him 3 more days of a very particular kind of silence, the kind where he was overly polite to me in front of the kids and wouldn't quite meet my eyes when it was just us, before something shifted. On the 4th day, he came home early from work, sat down across from me at the same kitchen table, and told me he'd called his mother. His mother, Linda, is not a soft woman. She raised Rob and his 2 brothers mostly alone after his dad left when Rob was 9, and she has never once in the 9 years I've known her minced words about anything. Rob told me she let him talk for about a minute before she stopped him and asked him one question. She asked him whose body he came out of. He said he didn't have an answer for that. She apparently told him a story I'd never heard before, about her own recovery after having Rob's older brother, a hard delivery that left her in the hospital for 11 days, and how Rob's father had made a comment about 6 weeks postpartum, something about getting back to normal, and how she had never fully forgiven him for it even decades later, even after everything else that man did. She told Rob that comments like that don't disappear. They sit in a woman for years. She told him if he didn't fix what he'd started, he'd be having this exact conversation with his own daughter about her mother one day, except by then it would be a memory instead of a mistake he could still correct. He cried telling me that part, actually cried, which I'd seen maybe twice in 9 years of marriage. He said he didn't even really care about Diana or Greg. Not truly, that somewhere in the last few months he'd just felt like he was losing at something. Work stress piling up, feeling like less of a provider than he wanted to be, and Diana's transformation had become this symbol in his head of a problem he could point at and pretend to fix instead of dealing with what was actually eating at him. He said it was easier to focus on my body than to admit he felt like he was failing at his own life. I told him that didn't make it okay. He said he knew, we're in therapy now. And I want to be clear that we didn't start because I forgave him quickly, because I didn't. And honestly, some days I still don't know if forgiveness is even the right word for where I've landed. We started because I told him I needed to understand what almost happened in our house before I could decide whether I could keep building a life with him. Our therapist, a woman named Carol who has a way of letting silences sit in the room until someone finally says the true thing, has spent a lot of our sessions asking Rob to sit with the discomfort of what he asked me to do, rather than rushing past it toward being forgiven. There was one session, maybe 6 weeks in, where Carol asked him directly what he thought my scar represented. He said after a long pause that he used to think of it as something that had happened to my body. He said he was starting to understand it was something my body had done, survived, accomplished, and that the difference between those 2 ways of seeing it was the whole problem. I'm not going to pretend that one sentence fixed 9 years of small comments and quiet comparisons. It didn't. But it was the first time I felt like he actually saw the scar the way I do, not as damage, but as proof. Diana, by the way, still has no idea any of this happened 2 doors down from her recovery. She waved at me last week while I was getting the mail, glowing, confident, genuinely happy in a way that has nothing to do with me and never did. I waved back. None of this was ever really about her. It never is it? It's always about what the person standing next to you decides your body means, and whether they're willing to sit in a bright bathroom light and actually finish the sentence when you ask them to. I think about the early days of us a lot now, more than I used to. Rob and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue when I was 24, and the thing that made me fall for him wasn't anything dramatic. It was that he laughed at my jokes even when they weren't that funny, and he remembered small things, like that I took my coffee with oat milk before oat milk was something every coffee shop carried. He proposed on a Tuesday, no big production, just handed me the ring while we were doing laundry and said he didn't want to wait for a special occasion because every day with me already felt like one. I used to tell that story at dinner parties. I haven't told it in a while. I bring this up because one of the hardest parts of the last few months has been holding 2 true things in my head at once. That Rob is a man capable of saying something as thoughtless and damaging as get your stomach fixed, and that Rob is also the man who once drove 90 minutes in a snowstorm to bring me soup when I had the flu and he was scared to leave me alone. People aren't villains in one scene and heroes in another. They're the same person doing both things. And figuring out what that means about your marriage is a lot messier than any story makes it sound. About 2 months after the bathroom conversation, Diana actually invited me over for coffee. I almost said no. Some part of me thought if I sat in her kitchen, I'd somehow be endorsing the whole chain of events that started with her surgery and ended with my husband asking me to erase my C-section scar. But I went because we've been neighbors for 6 years and Emmy and her daughter are in the same dance class and avoiding her forever wasn't realistic. We sat at her kitchen island and she told me about the recovery, how the first week was worse than anyone warned her, how she couldn't lift her own toddler for almost a month and had to have her mother fly in to help. She said something that stuck with me. She said she didn't do it for Greg or for anyone else. She did it because after 2 kids and a lot of years of not recognizing her own body in the mirror, she wanted to feel like herself again. And this was the way she chose to get there. She said Greg was supportive either way, that he told her before the surgery that he loved her body exactly as it was and would love it exactly as it would be, and that the choice was entirely hers to make. I sat there with my coffee going cold, thinking about how differently that story could have gone if Greg had instead spent 3 weeks dropping hints at dinner, if he'd sat her down at a kitchen table and used the word fixed. The procedure wasn't the problem. It never was. The problem was a man deciding on his wife's behalf that her body needed correcting and dressing that decision up as concern. I didn't tell Diana the whole story that day. I told her a version of it, enough that she understood something had happened. And she got quiet for a second and said, Greg would never, and then caught spot herself, because none of us really know what we'd do or say under a certain kind of pressure until we're standing in it. She squeezed my hand and told me she was glad I said something to Rob instead of just quietly starting to hate him for it, which I think is closer to wisdom than she realized in the moment. There's a session with Carol I keep coming back to, where she asked me a question I wasn't ready for. She asked what I was actually afraid of underneath the anger. I said I was afraid that if I let this go too easily, it would just happen again in some other form 5 years from now. Some other neighbor, some other comparison, and I'd wake up one day having slowly sanded myself down into whatever version of a woman kept the peace in my house. Rob was sitting right next to me when I said it, and I watched his face change, like he was hearing for the first time that this wasn't really about a tummy tuck at all. It was about whether he saw me as a whole person or as a project with room for improvement. He asked me in that same session what would make me feel safe again. I didn't have a full answer that day. I've built one slowly since in pieces. I told him I needed him to stop talking about other women's bodies in front of me like they were data points in an argument he was building. I needed him to say out loud, unprompted, that my scar meant something to him besides an imperfection, and to mean it enough times that I stopped bracing for the next comment. I needed him to understand that I'm sorry wasn't a finish line. It was a starting point for a much longer stretch of proving it. There was a rough patch about 3 months in where I genuinely didn't know if we'd make it. I remember standing in the shower one morning, tracing the scar with my fingers, really looking at it for maybe the first time since Josie was born, thinking about the sound of the monitors in that operating room, the moment they finally got her out, and there was that terrible silent stretch of seconds before she cried, the way Rob's hand had gone white-knuckled around mine. I stood there and I thought, this is the same man. The one whose hand went white in that room is the same man who called my body broken at our kitchen table. I didn't know how to reconcile that, and some mornings I still don't fully. What changed things, slowly, wasn't one big gesture. It was smaller things adding up. He started coming to Josie's follow-up appointments without being asked, sitting in the waiting room reading about the long-term effects of the delivery she'd had, things I don't think he'd ever actually looked into before. Like he needed to understand the full weight of what my body went through, rather than just accepting the surface version. He stopped bringing up Diana entirely, not in a stiff, avoidant way, but because I think he genuinely stopped seeing her as a measuring stick. One night, unprompted, while we were getting ready for bed, he knelt down and kissed the scar, and didn't say anything dramatic about it. Just did it like it was an ordinary part of me, which it is. I asked him once, months later, if he still thought about what Greg said at the gym, the comment about being happier since Diana's surgery. He said he thought about it differently now. He said he used to hear that as the surgery fixed their marriage, and now he heard it as a man supported his wife's choice about her own body, and that support was the actual thing that mattered. And those are two very different lessons to take from the same sentence. We're still married. We're still in therapy every other week, though we've talked about moving to monthly soon. Some nights are easier than others, and I won't pretend the memory of that kitchen table conversation doesn't still surface sometimes, uninvited, usually late at night when the house is quiet in that same particular way. It was the night I made him stand in front of that mirror, but I haven't looked away from my reflection once since then, and neither has he. And somewhere in a house 2 doors down, Diana is living her own version of this story, one where a man supported a choice instead of demanding one. And some days I catch myself grateful she never has to know how close her happy ending came to becoming the reason mine almost fell apart.